In the UK, there have been many infamous notorious criminals. However, one face stands out amongst the others. One that is instantly recognisable for all the wrong reasons. It's the face of a man who has spent nearly 50 years behind bars, despite never having killed anyone, never having harmed a child, never having harmed a woman. This year, he had the chance of freedom. But will he ever be fit for release? Or has the prison system created a monster that will be caged forever? I'll be examining his notorious behaviour behind bars and the parole's decision on whether or not to release him. This is the story of one of the UK's most violent criminals. This is the case of Charles Bronson. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I am so glad that I've been able to cover this case because I've wanted to do it for a long time, but I knew that his appeal was coming up and therefore I wanted to make sure that it was fully covered, so I've waited for the outcome. I would be so interested to know your feelings about Charles Bronson. I would love to know the sentiments that you feel when I tell you about his past, his criminality, and also the bid for freedom he's recently made. What are your feelings regarding this particular individual? You may be surprised to hear my feelings, but as ever, I'm going to try to give you my honest reflection after researching this case and also after considering what the prison system is meant to be about. I will let you draw your own conclusions that I would love to hear in the comments at the end of this. Also, big shout out to all of you coming to say hi to me at my tour, The Serial Killer Next Door. I appreciate massively all of you who come, say hi, and also the YouTube members and my Patreon members. Can't do this without you. Say that all the time, just as a reminder that I never underestimate the kindness of you guys. But as ever, for those of you who can't support me financially in that way, I want you to know that every like, every comment, every view, it is priceless to me. So thank you very much. Let's get on with today's case. It's a contentious one, guys. It's a contentious one. And I'm sure a lot of you will have seen movies on Charles Bronson. There's been what I consider a Hollywoodization of this particular individual. And with that, often the facts are lost. And there's a problem there. It creates a bias in our society. And where there is bias, sometimes there isn't fairness. And that can be a real problem. So let's get started. So for the past 9 years, just to let you know before I kind of carry on with this particular video, Charles Bronson has actually been known as Charles Salvador, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to refer to him as Bronson. I've got absolutely no disrespect intended towards the man whatsoever. It's just the name that most people know him by, but I just want to acknowledge that he calls himself Charles Salvador these days. So he was actually born Michael Gordon Peterson on the 6th of December 1952. His parents were Ira, which is a gorgeous name. When I found out about his mother's name, I was like, that is absolutely beautiful. But Ira and Joe Peterson, and Bronson was one of 3 sons. The family actually lived in Luton until he was a teenager, and they then moved to Cheshire. Now, according to his family and people who knew him in early childhood, he was a lovely lad. Apparently, he was a really justice-seeking child, so to speak. So he was great with kids and was the absolute opposite of a bully. He had a real connection with people who were weaker than him, and he felt the need to defend the weak. So when we're looking at the red flags in early childhood, we're not really seeing them. There's a secure base. He's a loved child. He's considered somebody who is pro-social and certainly seems to have a sense of the right and wrongs in this world. The fact that he defends the weak is a really positive trait that most of us would celebrate. So those big red flags that we see in lots of criminal behaviours that expose themselves in early childhood, they're just not really there. But it does feel like the move from Luton, when he moves to Merseyside, that is something that has a huge impact on him. And I think that we can all agree that when you move your location, there is a huge change and transition that occurs psychologically. You don't have your friends, you're new to an area, people don't know who you are, and there are different opportunities that come with that. First of all, there's reinvention, because people don't know you. So essentially, you can become a whole new person to the individuals that you meet. Secondly, it's lonely. It doesn't matter how much you are loved and how close your family members are. The point is, you want peers. And when you're thrown into a new world, a new area, new school, and all the things that go with it, finding your feet can be really difficult. And belongingness and connection is so powerfully important for human beings. So for Bronson, arriving in this new area and meeting new people may mean that instantly, the first group that he comes across that are accepting, he's going to attach himself to, because it makes the world less scary, less intimidating, and you feel a sense of belonging within that. And unfortunately, that can also mean that if the first group who come along aren't necessarily the best people for you, that's not going to mean that you don't attach yourself to them. And it does seem that when he arrives in Merseyside, Bronson does fall in with a bad crowd and behaviour changes. So he began truanting from school. To be fair, I truanted from school pretty much from the entire ages of 13 to 18, and I didn't fall into criminality. Truanting and criminality, I don't feel, are necessary bedfellows. But nonetheless, he starts to truant, he gets into fights, quite a big lad. So again, if you're with a group of boys who maybe are a little bit street smart, then the chances are that you're going to follow suit with your behaviour, because again, it gives you meaning. But we see this descent into a more violent side of his nature. And then the criminality aspect really begins. So he and 3 other lads would commit robberies, which is a pretty high-level crime for a juvenile. And age 13, he actually ends up getting held in juvenile court on a charge of robbery. So when we talk about robbery, we're talking about things like muggings. So it is quite a high-level crime. And it does feel like this brush with the law, it starts a pattern in his behaviour. And that pattern is pretty extensive, because for the next 50 years, he spends the majority of his life incarcerated, which is a huge amount of time. You just think about how many years you've been on this earth, and then imagine 50 of those being locked up. Some of you are probably 15, 16. So you're thinking about 3 full lifetimes in that context of being locked up. And that's how long he's spent behind bars. And this has actually earned him the reputation as the most violent prisoner in the UK. And when they use that description, I find it quite unfair, because I think about somebody holistically. I don't think about an action within a certain environment. I look at an individual as a whole, and I think about some of the criminals that are in prison. The idea that he's the most violent prisoner in the UK doesn't really add up for me, although he is without doubt violent. Now, in 1969, he actually meets his first wife, Irene Kelsey. He marries her the following year. This is when Irene was 4 months pregnant. When you think about 1969, certainly to have illegitimate children was massively frowned on in our society. It's actually really hard to imagine, isn't it, a time where getting pregnant was seen as the end of the world for girls. And the reality is they decide to get married. So again, even though we see Bronson on one level being negative in society with his violence, etc., certainly when it comes to responsibility in this moment, he's willing to take that plunge. So they get married because she is pregnant. I'm sure that there was also strong feelings there as well. But certainly he's following a particular societal pattern, which means that foundationally, on a psychological level, you can see that there are cues that he's picked up from his own experience growing up with a loving family that have then eventuated in making these kind of decisions. So she later goes on to give birth to a little boy, Michael Jonathan Peterson. Now, Bronson, at this moment in time, he actually manages to secure a stint of work as a strongman. You know, in the circus, when you see the men coming on, often in red and white striped attire, with the handlebar moustaches in circuses and being really strong, this is where essentially he grows that trademark handlebar moustache. So this is what he's doing, is this circus strongman. And obviously that's a very showy job, isn't it? So it speaks to a level of confidence within him, but it also suggests that there isn't necessarily that security that would be necessary to be a husband. Because being somebody who works not necessarily full time because you're kind of doing circus work is probably not going to bring in the money that's required when you have a young family. So despite the fact that he's got a wife, he's got a child, and he's got employment, albeit not necessarily the most secure employment, this all to the outside world seems like an individual who's succeeding in society because they're the trademarks of what we expect for a pro-social human. They're working, they're in a relationship, they've got a child. But Bronson was certainly not a family man. I'm not saying that he didn't have positive intentions towards his child and his wife. I'm saying the actions that we see follow are not necessarily in the best interests of the family, hence why we're not equating him to being the perfect family man. And in 1974, he actually gets convicted of an armed robbery. He's only 22 when this happens. And that's a big charge, isn't it? Armed robbery is one of those kind of crimes that is really traumatic for everybody involved as a victim. And on top of that, it shows a lack of understanding about social boundaries, poor impulse control, and of course, a willingness to be armed, which makes you super dangerous. So this happens when he's 22. He's sentenced at this point to 7 years in prison. So if you think about that, if he'd served his sentence and behaved himself in prison, he could essentially have been released around his mid-20s. But the problem is, with Bronson, behaving is not necessarily something that you can equate to him, at least not in his early years by any stretch of the imagination. So whilst he's in prison, he develops a clear reputation. And this reputation is that he's a very violent prisoner. And because he is in prison and he is refusing to abide by the rules, regulations and consequences, this means that he starts getting time added to his sentence. So this will be for things like attacking other inmates and prison officers, for damaging property, and on one occasion he actually attacks another prisoner with a glass jug, which is obviously a really dangerous thing to do. You think about a glass jug, first of all, they're very heavy, secondly, they can shatter. So we're not talking about a light attack here, we're talking about violent attacks. And because of these issues that he has, both with authority and with other inmates, he poses a real problem because essentially they consider him a risk. So that means that they end up making a decision where most of his sentence is served in solitary confinement. And just to put it out there, solitary confinement is torturous. I'm not saying that there isn't a reasoning behind doing it. Clearly you want to keep people safe, and in the society, particularly in the modern day, where everything's about litigious activity, people suing you, whether you're in prison or otherwise, everybody has a no-win, no-fee case these days if something goes wrong. You don't want, as an authority figure, to place other individuals that you're meant to protect in the line of fire. So therefore, the way that you manage that is to remove the problem. But when that problem is therefore placed in solitary confinement and has no contact really with other human beings, the impact that that has on their mentality, on their psychology, on their social experience, on their emotional welfare is going to be catastrophic. There's no other way of describing it. And to spend most of your sentence in that scenario where you are totally alienated and isolated, that is going to cripple parts of your personality. And also this is exacerbated further because he keeps getting moved to lots of different prisons. This includes Wakefield, Walton, Wandsworth and Gartree. So these are huge issues because, like anywhere and anything in life, we like familiarity, we like consistency, and we like security no matter who we are. In fact, the more fractured we might be as a human being, the more requiring we are of those features in our lives. So when you can't really feel that your environment is a safe place or is one that you can believe is going to still be there tomorrow, that again is going to be psychologically fracturing. And these frequent transfers, I would personally say they become essentially a signature of Bronson's incarceration. It becomes synonymous with who he is. And these are, of course, meant to keep him in check. They're meant to be the thing that lets him know you're not in control. We have power over you. We make decisions over your life, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I appreciate that when somebody has an issue with authority psychologically and physically, that you need them to be aware that they are not driving the car. But if those actions end up having a really seriously detrimental effect on a prisoner's well-being, it's questionable. Because on one hand, you're saying, we're in charge, we can do what we want with you. And on another hand, you're actually causing more damage, which is the absolute counter to what you're meant to be doing when you're dealing with somebody who's incarcerated. So this detrimental effect, it affects him psychologically, but it also affects him on a behaviour level. And that is something that becomes, again, a big pattern within his incarceration. And whilst he is incarcerated at once with prison, he actually goes ahead and tries to poison the prisoner next door to him, which is extreme. Don't get me wrong. We've all had neighbours we don't like. Just saying. Poisoning them is probably not the best course of action. There again, I've never been incarcerated with somebody permanently next to me. Who knows where I'd go? So we get to 1976, and at this point, again, he's transferred. So he goes to Pankhurst Prison. Now, this is a pretty legendary prison with respect. So he ends up being on the same wing as what would be known as legendary figures from the criminal world, probably most notably the Kray twins. And actually Bronson did become really good friends with them. And he even described them as the best two guys I've ever met. I imagine that they were very nice as long as they weren't torturing and killing you. But arguably, you're not a criminal or a murderer all of the time. 95% of the time, you might be a thoroughly decent individual. It's just you don't want to be around them the other 5% of the time. But again, I think the fact that he becomes good friends with the Kray twins speaks to that adolescence that we see when he moves to Merseyside. He's desperate to belong, to connect, to stand out, to be considered somebody with a good rep, and they embody that whole London gang mentality with respect and old school values. And I imagine that connecting with that was really important to him. Also, I found this quite amusing when I was researching it. So despite Reggie Kray's fearsome reputation, and my God, it was fearsome for the right reason, he said that he was apparently terrified at coming face to face with Bronson. He described it as his most frightening person experience. And I guess that also humanises the Krays, really, because whilst in prison, they haven't got all of those members around them to protect them. So I guess they felt more isolated, more vulnerable. And somebody like Bronson, who is pretty intimidating physically, when you don't have your men around you to protect you, he likely would seem quite a terrifying person. But it also intrigues me that we have one of the Krays saying that meeting him was just terrifying. And yet for Bronson, it was a really positive experience. He thought they were lovely. And that instantly makes me think about the way that the world interprets an individual versus the way they actually consider themselves to feel. Because in that moment, you have Bronson thinking, lovely blokes, really like them. And yet he's appeared like a terrifying figure. And that mismatch between reality and myth, again, that provokes a bias. And I say that because I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today involves that bias and the danger of those biases. So after this move, again, the pattern continues. He gets later moved back to Wandsworth, and it's here again, he ends up back in solitary confinement. Now, the reason for that is he's been trying to dig himself out of the prison. And, you know, just going to say, feels a little bit like a 1950s escape movie, the idea of just digging yourself out of prison. But clearly he's very unhappy inside, and it's his way of trying to retain a level of control, and it's not effective. He doesn't manage to escape, but it certainly causes him an issue because he ends up by himself once again. And because he gets caught for this attempt. He actually ends up getting revenge on the prisoner who grassed him up, and he apparently scarred him for life. I think that that's where the whole snitches get stitches kind of mentality comes from. But arguably, I suppose, when you think about somebody like Bronson, his mindset would be that you don't tittle-tattle. You don't grass on other prisoners. You know, that's a rule that you don't break. You should be on the side of the inmates, not of the authority. So for him, it would breach a code. And I'm not excusing his behaviour, but I think it's really important to look at the insight into why he would act this way. Now, whilst he is in prison, Irene, understandably, and I think we can all agree this makes sense, she files for divorce. She wasn't prepared to wait for him because his sentence just keeps increasing, and that's a direct reflection as well about the worth that she'd feel. You know, I have a child with you and you're consistently doing things that get you into more trouble and mean you can't come home. I think she deserved her freedom without a shadow of a doubt. And I think it also typifies the fact that he's quite egocentric in his nature. He's not concerned about his wife and child. He's concerned about how he's coming across in prison. And again, that doesn't mean he doesn't love his wife and child. It just means that his priority base is incorrect at this moment in time. Now, his behaviour carries on deteriorating. And I imagine that her wanting to get a divorce from him would have incited this further, because he has no control anyway. And now the foundation of security and support that he has on the outside, that's disintegrated. And we understand why, and it makes sense. But nonetheless, that's going to exacerbate those feelings of life not being fair, him not having options, and fueling that sense of not having the control over the world that he wants to have the control over, which most of us can acknowledge and identify with. We all like a level of control in our world. He, without a shadow of a doubt, enjoyed the kudos of the fight, the reputation, the thrill, and he liked the fact that he was known amongst the other prisoners. They knew he was a hard man. They knew he was an individual who they shouldn't cross, and if they crossed him, there would be consequences. But I think there's a big facade with this man. I really do. And I think that beneath that hard man reputation-based surface, there's genuinely an individual who struggles with his mental wellness. And there are then these further attacks on the prison staff and other inmates. But he also ends up with a suicide attempt. So the fact that he's trying to kill himself and actually thinking about getting out of prison in a different way, yes, that speaks to rebellious nature to some degree. You know, there is a reality that some people try to take their own lives because they're refusing to live by the rules and regulations that are being imposed on them. And it's a way of permanently, sadly, removing themselves from that situation. But also, when you're feeling isolated, abandoned, as if your life has got little meaning, then trying to take your own life can make sense. And at this point, they decide, oh, well, the reason that he's done this, because he's been violent to other staff, violent to other prisoners, and now he's tried to harm himself, is because he's criminally insane. And for me, again, the words criminally insane, it kind of sounds like something out of a horror movie, but in reality, what we're talking about here is just serious mental decline. He then gets diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and paranoid personality disorder. And at this point, he gets transferred to Broadmoor, which is a very high security psychiatric hospital. He gets referred there in 1978. And then he ends up getting transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital. So again, we're getting these real big transitions. And you can imagine the kind of individuals that you end up with when you go somewhere like Broadmoor. For example, Ian Brady comes straight to mind. Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. These are individuals who are sex killers, child killers. I will tell you now, we don't need to know a lot about Charles Bronson to know that those kind of individuals will be people that he despises. He is old school in a lot of his belief systems, and harming women and children will be so off the list of acceptable. It's unbelievable. And it's unsurprising to me that he doesn't mix well with the other offenders who are there, the other patients who are there, those who are really seriously mentally ill. He doesn't connect with them. And the fact that he's surrounded by sex killers, rapists, child murderers. And again, it doesn't actually surprise me that he nearly strangles to death a child rapist and killer, a guy called John White. He almost manages to murder him. And be aware, I'm not for 1 second legitimising the fact that he goes ahead and does this and saying that that's acceptable. I'm saying the idea of taking someone with the mindset of Charles Bronson and placing him in a situation surrounded by the very individuals he would despise most in the world is not a safe recipe. You don't need to be a forensic psychiatrist or psychologist to come to that conclusion. You just have to have an ounce of common sense. So he actually, when he went ahead and tried to kill John White, one of the motivations was he just wanted to be sent back to a regular prison. He couldn't stand being in that environment. So the way he did this, basically he was in the day room. And because the staff weren't necessarily as present as they needed to be in that moment, he took this opportunity. He was sitting behind White. Bronson, at this point, removes his tie. Why was he allowed to wear a tie? Honestly, when I come across this research, there's a bit of my head that's just like, let's just think about this. This is a secure psychiatric facility. Anything that could be made into a ligature or into a scenario where you could harm yourself with a particular item should be obviously removed. I mean, that's why they take your shoelaces off when you get arrested, even when you've never shown any issues with mental health. The point is, how was he wearing a tie? I don't know, was it the Sunday best? Were they allowed 1 day a week wearing a suit? No, they probably weren't. What I'm putting out there is, he shouldn't have been wearing a tie. So he does get it off, wraps it round White's throat, and then he pulls it as hard as he can. And apparently the other patients just watched. And it was so serious. When I say that he attempted to kill him, he kind of did, if I'm honest, because he stopped his heart. So Bronson said, even when he recollects and recalls that particular incident, he said he was just laughing manically, just totally lost it whilst he was doing it. And he acknowledges that in that moment he felt that he'd mentally lost it. And Bronson recalls that this guy had his eyes bulging out, White's face had turned blue, his tongue was hanging down his chin, and he even gave the death rattle. But fortunately, at this moment in time, staff did manage to intervene and at the last second saved his life. So Bronson got dragged away from that situation, apparently manically laughing. And at this point, they did manage to bring White back using a heart defibrillator. Now, Bronson wasn't actually charged with murder at this point, because as we know, if you are considered criminally insane, mentally too unwell to be accountable for your actions, you can't be. So he wasn't held responsible for those actions. Bronson, at this point, then spends 11 months at Rampton, and half of that was actually in isolation, which again, when you think about somewhere like Rampton being a place that's meant to look after the psychological well-being and psychiatric needs of the patients who are there, I think that anyone with any understanding of mental health knows that isolation is catastrophic. And for him to have spent half of the 11 months by himself, that's, again, a failure without a doubt. And ultimately, they conclude that they just can't treat him. It's as simple as that. And at this point, he ends up back in Broadmoor for another 5 years. So, frying pan fire feels like the correct analogy in this moment in time. I don't know what they are trying to achieve by placing Bronson in a place where he's going to be dangerous because he despises the individuals who surround him. So it's unsurprising, isn't it, when I tell you that Bronson then goes ahead and tries to strangle yet another patient. This is a guy called Gordon Robinson. Apparently he didn't like Robinson, clearly. That's the kind of thing you do when you try and strangle somebody to death. You're not exactly enamoured by their personality in these circumstances. But he described him as a loudmouth, so I think that he just struck him as somebody who was trying to be bigger and bolder than he felt that he deserved to be. And Bronson wants to put him in his place, so to speak. And even though he definitely intended to kill him, he failed. And the reason that he failed is the fact that he had a silk tie that he tried to use as the ligature. It snapped. I don't get it either, guys. I don't know whether Savile Row popped in on a regular basis to show them the array of ties that they could choose. Bronson obviously realising that a higher quality silk tie isn't higher quality for the kind of jobs that he was wanting to do. I don't get it. You know, why don't just arm them with a samurai sword as well? A range of weapons. These days, it won't be the case. These days, we don't allow people to have things like ties when they're in secure units that are psychiatric because of the harm and risk they can do to themselves and to others. But clearly, they hadn't got the memo back in the day. It's also whilst he's here that he manages to evade prison staff and makes it onto the roof. This is in 1982. It's quite infamous, this. Now, he gets talked down on his first occasion because, without a doubt, Bronson does have the potential and ability to negotiate. That is clear when you listen to him communicate, when you listen to him explain himself. There is within him an understanding of the actions and consequences. I'm not saying that he cares about the consequences, I'm saying that he understands them. So he gets talked down this first occasion, but then manages to go back up shortly after. Again, like the tie memo, maybe they should have figured out how to prevent such situations. But who am I to suggest this kind of logic? So he gets back on the roof a second time and he staged a 3-day rooftop protest. And to be fair, he caused a huge amount of damage. He caused about £250,000 worth of damage, which is obviously highly problematic. And it gives a message out to those in authority, which means that they don't feel they're in authority, which is a massive problem, because what you don't want in any system, whether it's in the corporate world, the prison world, or the psychiatric world, you don't want those that you're meant to be in control of letting you know that you don't have control. That can be incredibly destabilizing for everybody involved, and it can put the staff at risk, because if prisoners start to believe that they can take control, it can have a massive impact on behaviour. So it is problematic when somebody does this kind of stuff. And I would say it doesn't take much longer from this moment in time where he's on the roof and he does this damage. He's obviously letting the world know that he's struggling in a very open way, that something changes. Something really switches in him. I'm not saying that we're going to have some kind of mass transition for Bronson, but I would say he finds his salvation. He discovers art. And this is no slight interest in art. This is something that I feel makes Bronson consider the world in a different way, in a different perspective. I think he finds a way to express himself, be creative, to fundamentally transition some of the rage that he feels into something progressive, creative, pretty amazing if I'm honest. And before long, he's actually winning awards for his surreal artwork. And this is all about the kind of way that he expresses what his time in prison has been like. He writes poetry. So we're seeing this real capability within him. And again, this is not going to excuse the behaviours that I've talked about. It's not going to excuse the behaviours I'm going to talk about. But I'm saying that we have to view a human being holistically. Certainly when we're thinking about their long-term incarceration, we have to imagine progress, process. We also have to think about coping strategies. And we also have to think about the certain aspects of a human personality that speaks to us and says something that ultimately shows us that it's not all a particular colour of character, that there's actually shades to a personality. And it's important to note that, because if there are shades to a personality that are beautiful and creative and powerful, then if you speak to those particular shades, you have an opportunity of amplifying them. If you amplify them effectively, you can dampen down some of the more problematic traits within a human being. Now, Bronson is not out of the woods, because he ends up going on an 18-day hunger strike, which is very dangerous, but also is something that speaks to unhappiness. To have the capacity and determination to spend that long not eating, it's very challenging, particularly for a big guy like him. But he goes on this hunger strike, And because of this, Bronson gets moved to Ashworth Secure Hospital. Then he gets moved to Park Lane Secure Hospital. So we're seeing, again, these constant transitions. And when he's at Ashworth, he stabs another patient. This is Mervyn Harley. He's basically stabbed with a sauce bottle. And apparently the reason that he did this is Hawley made sexual advances towards him, which would be an absolute clear no-go with Bronson. I have to say, it would be a no-go with a lot of people. And if you have a violent disposition and that kind of thing happens, well, arguably people will see this as leverage to attack. I'm not defending it. I'm saying that individuals, particularly with a violent nature and a very heterosexual outlook on the world, would see it as a personal insult and slur if somebody made advances towards them. And rebutting that and letting that person know without a shadow of a doubt that they are not welcome would be very important to Bronson's belief of his manliness. So at this point, for that, he gets 3 more years added to his sentence. Then he gets returned to Walton Prison. So again, we're getting these transitions. There's no security, there's no foundation. And here he returns to type regarding the Rooftop protest. He stages this protest and he causes £100,000 worth of damage. At this point, he gets another year added to his sentence. And like we've seen before, Bronson then just seems to get moved from facility to facility. And so eventually ends up at Wormwood Scrubs. And here he really does push the boundary because he ends up attempting to strangle the prison governor. And that led to him actually serving the rest of his sentence in isolation. I think we can all agree by this point that Charles Bronson does not know how to help himself in these scenarios. I mean, it's not good attacking other prisoners, certainly not good attacking prison guards, but I think going for the actual prison governor is probably the worst type of violence that you could ever create in your scenario to make it worse. Now, he finally gets released in 1987. Now, this is after serving pretty much double his original 7 years sentence. And at this point, he goes back to Luton, which I suppose was a place where he reflected and remembered happiness. His life there was good. His family said he was well loved, he was well liked, he fitted in. He was a defender of the innocents, he liked justice. So going back to Luton would probably feel like home. He starts with a short stint as a bare knuckle fighter. These are obviously in illegal underground boxing matches, but again, I would suggest that that fits perfectly with his psychology. He's got a hard man reputation. He's worked in the circus, being a strongman, and also in prison. His reputation precedes him. So I do believe that he would feel that fighting was an area that he could excel. And it's around this time that he actually changes his name officially to Charles Bronson. This is the name that he uses in fighting. And basically, he calls himself after the American actor, although he'd never actually seen a Charles Bronson film. Charles Bronson films are actually quite good. Ironically, I spent quite a lot of time truanting seeing some of those films, so didn't waste all my time. Actually have an excellent knowledge of pretty much movies from the 1950s all the way through to the 1980s. So, you know, who's winning? If I'm in a pub quiz, I'm going to do all right. Not going to get me the PhD, but nonetheless, going to do all right. Just throwing it out there. Person with a PhD probably wouldn't know how to answer my historic knowledge on Judy Garland movies, for example. Throwing it out there. But anyway, he takes his name this way, which is kind of quite a cool story. And even though he's out for a short period of time, it doesn't last very long. So he reverts to type, carries out an armed robbery on a jewellery shop in 1988. And the reason that he does this is he wanted to get his girlfriend a ring. I'm going to throw it out there, Charles, that maybe doing a paid off in instalments route would have been more effective. But again, what we're seeing there psychologically, poor impulse control, poor consequential thinking, and also a very naive, childish way to impress somebody. The idea that you want it now, because you want to give your girlfriend it now, and you're not thinking about the impact on your own needs, that demonstrates a naivety, a childishness. And I'm not pretending that that childishness is not very dangerous in this situation. But what I'm trying to highlight is psychologically the way that comes across. To go into a shop, to literally put your freedom in such a problematic and fragile situation because you want to get a ring for your girlfriend demonstrates a real lack of consequential thinking and naivety. Now, the eyewitnesses who saw him doing this, they were actually too scared to testify against him because he's a terrifying character. But his girlfriend, she actually became the main prosecution witness, which I would imagine would be crippling for somebody like Bronson, because essentially he's out there making this big profession of love and she just goes and works for the prosecution. He then goes ahead and says, yeah, I'm guilty, and he gets sentenced to 7 years for that particular crime. I also think it's really important to note that when you've been incarcerated for a period of years, particularly when you're thinking about 14-ish years, it would be really helpful to have some kind of real close supervision, an opportunity to integrate into society more slowly, and a support mechanism out there that can help you to reintegrate into society. Because Bronson had been on the outskirts of society for a while anyway, and I do think that failures to apply that kind of logic is a problem that we see time and time again where reoffending is concerned. So he goes back into prison, and of course, what do we see? Complete revert to his previous behaviour. So he's fighting, he's vandalising property, and now he develops what I can only describe as a penchant for taking people hostage. And he actually goes on to amass a massive 17 convictions for violent behaviour whilst he's incarcerated. So these 17 convictions demonstrate that he just refuses to toe the line, and we have to have sympathy with those trying to keep him in check. But I do think by this point a lot of damage has been done to him, and his respect for the system is non-existent. I don't feel that he believed that they felt they were protecting him, and I don't feel he believed that they were ever going to try to rehabilitate him in a way that did not involve mass punishment as opposed to an opportunity to reform. Personally, that's just my understanding from what I've learned about him. I believe his psychology is he just did not trust the system in any way, shape or form. Again, not excusing his behaviour whatsoever. So aside from these 17 convictions, he barricades himself onto the prison rooftops on another 9 occasions, and they believe that when you actually add up all of the damage that he did during those particular protests, he caused £5 million worth of damage. And again, it destabilises the system. So he's kind of public enemy number one, even though we can all agree at this moment in time that we could draw up a list of far more sinister, malevolent, dangerous human beings who have been in prison. This is an individual who is constantly causing a level of outrage publicly because he's refusing to toe the line in any way. So after serving 4 years of his sentence at this moment in time, he gets released in 1992. He's actually 39 years of age at this point, but within 2 months, he's in trouble again. He actually gets charged with conspiracy to rob and also possession of a sawn-off shotgun. And if you think about his past behaviour and your past behaviour being indicative of your future behaviour, it wouldn't be difficult for the authorities to imagine that he was going to go and carry out an armed robbery again. So whilst he is on remand for this particular crime, this incident, he takes the librarian hostage. And I will tell you, in the list of demands for what one requires when holding somebody hostage, this list was strange for me. So he demanded an inflatable doll. Who wouldn't? I mean, if I'm in a hostage situation and I'm given an opportunity to think about the things I really need in my life, it's going to be an inflatable doll. It's going to be one of those really poor, cheap, large inflatable Ken doll type things. You know, the ones that look like somebody's literally taken a magic marker and drawn their eyebrows on. It's got Lego hair, that kind of thing. I can completely empathise with Bronson at this point. I'm like, yeah, on my list of what to do in a hostage situation, What do you want, Emma? Oh, do you know what I really want? No, tell us. I really want a massive inflatable doll. Yeah. Do you mean a sex doll? I find that an impertinent personal question. Just a big inflatable male doll. However they may come, please. That would be number one on my list. He also does go for a helicopter, quite an extreme jump, because obviously the reason that he wants the inflatable doll is you don't want to fly alone, do you? The irony here being I'm imagining that he would also need a helicopter pilot, because I can't imagine that at any point during his prison incarceration have just popped him on a course to do aviation. And also he wanted a cup of tea from negotiators. Now, that is a British tradition, and I think we can all agree, no matter who you are, and it's not nice to take anybody hostage, but no matter what line of criminal you are going to want a good old cup of British tea, probably Yorkshire tea, unless you're being very posh, and then you'll go for a Twining, shall we say, or those really expensive cups of tea that you don't understand have got their own like nylon bag, you know those ones, and you're like, this is why it costs £7 for a packet of 40. Sorry, just throwing it out there. Don't understand it. Tastes the same. But anyway, in this situation, I do imagine it was a nice strong cup of tea. But not exactly the list you'd expect. There's almost a comedic level to it. It's not comedic at all when you think about the poor person, that poor librarian who's been taken hostage. But there is, again, this childishness, this naivety. I want a blow-up doll, a helicopter and a cup of tea. So then we get to September 1993. He's found guilty of an intent to rob and he's sentenced to 8 years. This is a pretty stern sentence. And again, a lot of that will be to do with the aggravating factors. He's reoffending constantly. I will tell you now, and for those of you who might have seen Tom Hardy playing Bronson in the film Bronson, he has this iconic scene, and it's because Bronson actually ended up spending the first 40 days of his sentence naked, in isolation. I personally feel that that is massively degrading, and I'm sure that Bronson wasn't necessarily somebody who was afraid of that scenario. Who knows, he may have also created part of that scenario for notoriety, but I just feel, again, that there is a dehumanization level to the way that they treat this individual. I don't think they like his attitude. I don't think they like the fact that he has this ironic sense of being in the world, and he's really, really eccentric. And I think that a lot of artists are. Sorry if you're out there and you're an artist and you're like, Emma, I'm not eccentric. I'm perfectly typical. I love eccentricity. Look, I can't even coordinate my head scarf with my jumper. It's red and green. And my mum said, red and green should never be seen. But I am doing, because I'm eccentric. But I think he's really eccentric. I'll come on to that a little bit further down the line. Eccentricity makes people seem different, makes them less able to connect with large groups of individuals, very capable of connecting with individuals from a similar mindset and similar group. But what I'm saying is eccentricity stands out. People don't necessarily relate to it. It's what creates great invention. It's what makes human beings so full of idiosyncrasies and beauty. But it also means that people look at you differently. And I think eccentricity lies a great deal within the psychology of this man. So, as I said, he's back in prison, and then he ends up getting moved to various different prisons again, because that's how they manage him, with literally no foundation of support. Why they think moving him is going to do any good whatsoever, we can only assume that they're letting him know that he is not in charge. So in the end, he gets returned to Wakefield Prison. Now, this is known in the UK as Monster Mansion. And it should be known as Monster Mansion because, my God, has it got monsters under its roof. So people like Mick Philpott burnt his children to death. Ian Watkins, Lost Prophets lead singer, needs to be evaporated and vaporised from this world immediately. Raped babies and young children, coerced horrible paedophilic mothers to get involved with the abuse as well. Ian Huntley, responsible for the Soham murders of Jessica and Holly, and also Thomas Hughes. These are all individuals who basically were the most heinous human beings in the world. Thomas Hughes, by the way, is the father who murdered his 6-year-old son, Arthur Limbaugh Hughes. I've done a video on that, so feel free to look it up. Also done a video on Mick Philpott and Ian Huntley. Haven't done Ian Watkins yet. Do look forward to doing that. I imagine I'll get lots more death threats off his still avid fans, who I would like to spend half an hour in a room with, having a strong discussion as to why their actions denote something about their personality. I digress. And whilst he's kept in Monster Mansion, he's basically kept in the Hannibal cage. Now, again, if you've not seen my video on Robert Maudsley, it's worth having a look. The Hannibal cage comes from the fact that they associated Robert Maudsley with Hannibal Lecter, but actually if you listen to my story, you'll realise that's completely inappropriate and inaccurate, and it really drives me crazy how many people do videos suggesting this guy was a cannibal. He wasn't, and people should research more appropriately, because this is a myth, not a reality. But essentially, he gets placed in there. And we're talking about something like Robert Maudsley, who did carry out some really heinous murders. And then we're looking at somebody like Bronson, who hasn't ever harmed a woman or a child. Yes, he's done some awful things when he's been placed in situations, in secure units psychiatrically. But what I am noting is that when you compare the two, I'm not sure that he should have been there. So essentially, in that moment in time, he's placed in a position where he's almost synonymous with these individuals. And I imagine that would be quite disconcerting and upsetting for him. Now, what I will note here is that the prison officials, they actually really encouraged Bronson to really engage in his artwork. So whoever is in that prison and is working with him, they're noting this ability for him to be creative and expressive, and they want to speak to that. And I think that's really positive. But the problem is, it's almost like a little bit too late, because Bronson's been treated really harshly. And I appreciate that some of you might think it's due. I don't think it's due. I really don't. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination this man should have gone through so many years of harsh treatment, movement, transition, and isolation. I really don't. And because of this, Bronson's mental state is just falling apart. So it's not that at this moment in time at Wakefield they're not trying to engage him and help him and navigate him towards more positive action. It's that there's so much damage has been done. And unsurprisingly, Bronson proves to be far from model prisoner. So he's got this serious habit of taking hostages whilst he's incarcerated. And to date, when you look back on his incarceration, he's actually taken 9 people hostage in his history. And that includes Deputy Governor Adrian Wallace, that was at Hull in 1994. He actually held him hostage for 5 hours, and he injured him so badly that he had to be off work for 5 weeks. But obviously, if he'd wanted to do serious harm, he wouldn't have ever come back to work. So Bronson clearly wasn't intending to kill him. I do think where Bronson is concerned, he wants to punish people, but he has a boundary. I don't think it's the same when we're talking about child rapists, but I think we can evidence throughout the ages in prison, there are many prisoners who have murdered child rapists and women killers because they feel that they've breached a boundary and they deserve to die. I'm not, again, validating it. I'm saying that Bronson is not alone in the fact that he struggles in those environments. But when it comes down to taking people hostage, yes, he hurts people, but he could kill them and doesn't without a shadow of a doubt. So he takes this guy hostage. He also takes the Deputy Governor of Frankland prisoner. He takes his own solicitor on one occasion a hostage. He takes a doctor at Birmingham in 1996. So he's kind of got this scenario where this is the way that he gets attention. So following the one with the doctor, he gets sent back to Belmarsh. And whilst he's serving his sentence at Belmarsh in April 1996, he actually takes 3 inmates hostage. Now, this happens to occur because an Iraqi hijacker bumped into him and apparently didn't apologise, and this really got him, the fact that this guy didn't show any etiquette. So he ends up holding them in the cell, and allegedly he made them tickle his feet and call him General. Again, I am not saying that his actions are in any way defensible, but there is, again, this eccentricity and naivety to the way that he treats this situation, tickling his feet, calling him general. It's about humiliating them. It's about power, but he's not doing something that is causing a threat to life. Now, he did, during that particular hostage situation, he hit one of them with a metal tray, and then he felt really guilty. So he got that hostage who'd been hit with the metal tray to hit him back 4 times because he wanted to make them even. So even there, he's showing that he understands the power dynamic. Like, he's more powerful, therefore he deserves to get hit 4 times as opposed to once. Now, because of that, he ends up getting another 5 years added onto his sentence. Then he gets transferred to Hull, and this is really against his will. So he's moved again, and he doesn't want to be moved. So he's lost that sense of foundation, control, and he's back in the scenario where people are controlling what happens to him, which we all know is difficult for anybody to manage. But certainly there is this consistent theme as far as he's concerned, that he's never able to settle. And he actually ends up, when he's at Hull, taking his prison art teacher, Phil Danielson, hostage. That's in 1999. And the reason that they believe he took him hostage was that Danielson had actually criticised one of Bronson's drawings, which he should, because Danielson was actually the art teacher. It's up to him. That's his job, to critically analyse and to help. But at the end of the day, this obviously was something that crossed one of Bronson's boundaries. And it could be, again, speaking to that really childlike quality within him, where he feels hurt by the fact that somebody doesn't like what he's done. You know, he's worked hard on something and somebody's criticising it, and he doesn't know how to retaliate with that. He doesn't know how to emotionally express the pain that he feels for that. And so he acts in this way, he reverts to type. So he was actually teaching a class when this happened. Bronson bursts in, and there was a prison officer present at the time. And the prison officer, who's there to, I don't know, throwing it out there, protect the other inmates, and in particular, the art teacher, he just runs off. See ya. Just gonna run off. So can you tell me why then, with all that in mind, you ran off? Because I'm a prison officer, I get paid a pretty average wage, and this guy's massive and hits people with metal trays and tries to strangle them with scarves. And also, I just don't think I care that much about art. Literally, just does one. I mean, don't get me wrong, I appreciate that people have got a level of fear, fight, flight, freeze psychologically. Who knows how we'd be in those situations, but not very nice to leave this poor teacher alone with Bronson. And this means that Bronson has total carte blanche. So he wraps a skipping rope around Danielson's neck, drags him around the prison corridors, which must have been horrifying. And this poor guy, who, bear in mind, is essentially there to just help Bronson and to help bring him on in his artwork. This guy's held for 44 hours in his cell. That's from the 1st to the 3rd of February 1999. Can you imagine how you would feel in that situation? You're not going to believe that you're ever going to get out. And Bronson at this point was actually armed with a spear. He'd made it from a broom handle and a broken jar glass. So essentially he's armed and dangerous. And he even held the weapon to his ribs. And he told this guy, "You're going to die." That must have been absolutely horrifying for this art teacher. I mean, it's as far away from what you'd be expecting to experience in that scenario. I appreciate that when you're working with people who are quite dangerous, there is much more likelihood of situations unravelling that you wouldn't get in a normal school. Although I don't know, there are some schools these days that are pretty terrifying. But you know what I'm saying? Essentially, this guy would not be expecting this because, again, he's not even a guard. He's there to do nice things with the prisoners, and there's usually quite a high level of respect. And suddenly he's being held for days by somebody with a very violent history. Bronson, during this kidnap and hostage situation, also was vandalising the prison, really tore it up. I mean, he's physically very strong. At one point, he even tore a washing machine from the wall and he got electrocuted. Actually knocked him unconscious for a few minutes. Now, this is, again, what I consider quite strange where Bronson is concerned. He actually told Danielson afterwards, "You've been my best hostage." you're the only one who hasn't shit yourself. So he's congratulating this man for not losing the plot. I mean, internally, this guy must have been so traumatized, it's unbelievable. But because he seemingly held it together, and power to him to be able to do that in those circumstances, you know, when you're questioning your own mortality, whether you're questioning whether you're going to see your family again, these are all things that are probably going through your mind. And you're with a guy that you know can seriously harm you or kill you. And to seemingly hold it all together, it was something that Bronson really respected, and he conveyed that respect. Eventually, it took 15 riot police and tear gas to take him down. So the element of strength that Bronson has is enormous. And there's actually really memorable footage of a naked, greased-up Bronson jumping and dancing around as a scrum, I suppose I'd describe it as, of officers approach. So that is quite iconic. He's naked, totally greased up to make it difficult for them to catch him. And there's a whole group of these officers because they know that this man is a real contender when it comes to physicality. Now, after this happens, Bronson's given a life sentence. And just to know as well, Danielson, that poor guy, he ends up getting diagnosed with PTSD, acute anxiety disorder, has multiple breakdowns, and understandably he wasn't able to return to work following the attack. I think we can all empathise with why that would be the case. I don't think anybody could go back to work in that scenario knowing the potential for violence and harm that could befall them. So now Bronson's got this life sentence, and this means that he has a long stretch that is really at Her Majesty's leisure, because they can make a decision as to whether to let him go at some point or to keep him in forever, essentially, because that's how these sentences can work. So I imagine that this has also changed the mindset for Bronson. You know, he now is looking at years and years, and I suppose that he has to make some fundamental decisions about how he's going to spend those years. And he's actually become known for his fitness prowess. Essentially, he's dedicated, really dedicated his life to exercise. He's been in solitary confinement. He's never given up the need to exercise. He's consistently protected his body. He looks incredible. With respect, the guy looks incredible. He's somebody who physically is quite intimidating, but also you can't help but respect the body that he's got. But his age, it's clearly his coping mechanism. Exercise has been there for him when nobody else has. And he actually has created a regime specifically around exercising in confined spaces. So he's figured out the best way to keep fit in those circumstances. Now, allegedly, he could complete 172 press-ups in 1 minute. That is astonishing. Where is Norris McWhirter with the Guinness Book of Records? I am aware Norris McWhirter is dead, but I was a child and he was the person I associate with. But where is the person from the Guinness Book of Records to figure out whether this is true? And also, he can do 94 sit-ups in half a minute. Literally, I can't do 94 sit-ups. Actually, I can't do 94 sit-ups full stop. Probably something I should work on. Also, he's very physically powerful, without a doubt, but he's strong-minded as well. And I say that because I have to respect an individual who can survive so long in a prison regime, mostly in solitary confinement. I mean, it's absolutely torturous. It really is. Anybody who's been in solitary confinement, or also if you've been taken to a situation where you've been kidnapped, people like Terry Waite, kept for years in isolation when he was taken overseas, they talk about losing your mind to some degree because of being by yourself. And don't get me wrong, many form, as Terry Waite did, mental resilience, and they create coping mechanism strategies that none of us would ever have to conceive of, but they do it because otherwise they would literally go insane. To date, he's actually published 11 books. He's won multiple awards for his poetry, for his art. He's good. And he even went ahead and auctioned one of his pieces of art off to raise money for a child, because there was a child who needed help for treatment with cerebral palsy. That was in 2016. And he shows a real capability for art and poetry. It's pretty astounding. Now, in 2001, Bronson actually remarries. He married a woman called Sarah Reman, And she'd basically written to Bronson whilst he was in prison, and they got married at a ceremony at Milton Keynes prison. They'd met 9 times. Again, sorry, not enough. Look, I'm not saying this guy doesn't deserve a wife. I imagine he could be quite an amusing character. I'm saying that writing to someone and meeting them 9 times is a recipe for failure. Just failure. I don't have any more wise words from that, but I promise you, it's a recipe for failure. There'll be somebody watching now going, Emma, I literally didn't even meet my husband. I just got married. It was arranged and we're really happy. I get it. Some people do have that experience, but we're talking about Charles Bronson in prison and only meeting 9 times. Now, Bronson also, just a bit of trivia for you, converted to Islam. And he then started to call himself Charles Ali Ahmed. But the couple then ended up getting divorced 4 years later. Not surprising. Can't imagine it's the most fulfilling situation, being married to somebody behind bars. Then we get to 2014, and he ends up getting done for assaulting a prison governor. Now, the reason that he says that he assaulted that prison governor is because his prison mail was held back. And I can imagine that there is something so important about being written to when you're in prison. I can imagine it's like your lifeblood. It connects you with the outside world. It makes you feel part of something bigger than your isolation. And also it means that the people that you love, you connect with. And if you're getting written to by people who are attracted to you, that also reminds you of who you are as a human being. So it will be weighted very powerfully. And if somebody denies you that, it's probably going to exacerbate rage. Again, not defending his actions, just trying to understand the psychology for some of those things. And later that year, the same year, in August, he changes his name again, and he changes his name to who he is known as now, Charles Salvador. And that's a tribute to the Spanish surrealist artist Salvador Dali. Had a lot of those pictures on my walls when I was a student. I did like them. I did like them in the past. Now I look back and they're quite aggressive. But nonetheless, I did enjoy Dali's art. Went and saw his museum and the house that he built and kept all of his artwork in. And it is pretty astonishing. It's really weird as well. But it's, interesting, and Dali was certainly an individual that, similarly to Bronson, had the moustache going on, didn't they? But so individual, so eccentric, so unique. It doesn't surprise me at all that Charles Bronson associates him with actual Dali himself because of the fact that they have those kind of quirks. Now, at this point, Bronson even says that Bronson's dead, that he's done with the violence. And he quoted, "The old me dried up. Bronson came alive in 1987. He died in 2014. Some of you may feel that that's just not possible, that you can't just suddenly make a decision to dissolve part of your personality and to become a new version of yourself. I would say that reinvention is possible, and actually the existential crises that certain individuals go through where they believe that they have let go of the old self and reimagined the new, that does happen. Obviously, we have a long history with this violence. We can also say that with a long history of violence, you can get bored. You really can. It's why people stop offending often after the age of 50. And when you look at him now as an older person, it is quite possible that he doesn't feel the same motivation towards harming others. He feels as soothing because of his age, and he literally recreated and reimagined who he wanted to be. And that is this particular individual that he associates more with art, etc. So we get to 2017. His love life is busier than most. So Bronson marries an actress. She's called Paula Williamson. She's 36 at the time, and they get married in HMP Wakefield. She basically had small parts in Coronation Street, Emmerdale. Now, the marriage, sadly, only lasted a year. None of you saw that coming, did you? We always think these kind of relationships, very long term. Longevity, absolutely assured when you get married in prison. But he's the one who actually asked for a divorce, and I kind of understand why. Because there were, shall we say, some incriminating pictures that came to light of Paula on holiday in Tenerife, where a young man was literally burying himself into her cleavage. To be fair, she did have pretty impressive cleavage. but I don't think it's appropriate for a strange man to be burying his face into that cleavage when you are indeed married. I also doubt the young man knew that the person she was married to was Charles Bronson, with respect. Now, Bronson actually ended up completing the minimum term of his life sentence in 2003. And since then, the parole board have actually looked at his case 6 times. They've reviewed his case 6 times. He's been denied parole every single time. The last time was in November 2017. Bronson is currently incarcerated at HMP Wood Hill, which is in Milton Keynes. He literally spends 23 hours a day in his cell. I find that really distressing, genuinely. I know what he's done in the past is diabolical in a lot of ways, but I cannot wrap my head around the fact that we have a system where a man can be kept in isolation 23 hours a day. Apparently he listens to his radio or he concentrates on his art. And in the hour that he's actually allowed out of his cell, he only associates with 3 other inmates. So he has an incredibly limited social experience and an incredibly limited, physically free, as far as the prison is concerned, experience. We get to June 2020. Now, at this point, Bronson has basically successfully petitioned for a public parole hearing, and ultimately it was decided that it was actually in the public's interest to grant him one. Now, the first stage of this hearing was heard on the 6th of March this year. It was heard at Wood Hill Prison, which is near Milton Keynes in Buckinghamshire. Shortly into that hearing, 70-year-old Bronson spilled orange juice on himself. I can associate with that. People in my family believe that I have passed on a clumsy gene. My father was clumsy, I'm clumsy, my kids are super clumsy. I own it. That's why I wear pretty much the scruffiest clothes on the planet 97% of the time. Because at the end of the day, I don't care what food or drink goes on them. They're not expensive. I've figured a way to cope with that strategy. Also, there are some excellent stain removers. So who's winning? The person who's bothered to get spaghetti on themselves or me? It's me, by the way. So at this point, he spills orange juice on himself and he actually stands up and announces to the panel he hadn't pissed himself. Now, if you want to ingratiate yourself to a parole board at a public hearing, you kind of want to shut up and put up. You want to answer questions nicely. You want to nod in the right places. You want to manipulate. And I'm using that word purposefully because believe me, the one thing that Bronson doesn't do in this circumstance is manipulate. He's not got that type of character that actually I see problematic in other prisoners. Because if you're the kind of person who can manipulate and say what people want to hear, that doesn't mean that you're reformed. It just means that you're good at figuring out how to get yourself out of these situations. Bronson hasn't got those nuances. What you see is what you get. And ironically, I feel more at peace with a what I see is what I get kind of individual than somebody who knows how to play a system. So him standing up and doing that, it shows poor consequential thinking. I appreciate that. It shows poor social etiquette. I appreciate that. Why would he have any? He spent most of his life in solitude. So this is an individual that I would give complete excuses to for this kind of behaviour, but isn't going to look good on the panel. Also goes ahead and tells the panel that he'd done more porridge than Goldilocks and 3 bears, and he's sick of it. For those of you who don't know what porridge means, in the UK it means time. It means time spent inside. For those of you who are old enough to remember, there was actually a very good comedy series called Porridge, and it was one of those well-loved series in the UK, but that's the slang for it. Just like I say bang to rights when people are talking about being caught and captured red-handed, porridge means the amount of time that you've done it inside. So again, he's being very honest. Of course he's sick of it. And that ironic humour that he uses, that's something that stood the test of time. It's part of who he is. Now, the prison manager that was in charge of him at the time, they concluded that after decades of imprisonment, he wouldn't cope on the outside. She also believed he wasn't ready for an open prison. That actually, to me, banks of failures in the system, not of him. If you are telling me that after 5 decades, this guy isn't ready for some kind of reform on the outside, that's on you, not on him. And I say that professionally, personally, and morally and ethically, all of those things in tandem. The idea that he's spent so much time inside and he's not ready for an even open prison, a gradual scenario where he's getting more freedoms, that's absolute testament to systematic failures. Now, an hour into the actual hearing, Bronson says, "I'm getting bored, mate." Again, he's not playing the game. He's just saying how he feels. He's not got the interpersonal skills to know how to mediate that particular part of his character and personality. Some people can say, well, there you go. He's got poor impulse control. That makes him a danger to society. Or it could go, he really doesn't respect this. He's been there a lot of the time and he knows how this is probably going to go. And it must be boring after all these years, meeting the same brick wall again and again and again. During the proceedings, Bronson repeatedly swears. I don't think that should go against anyone. I've got a potty mouth. I'm sure a lot of you have got potty mouths as well. Not in front of the kids. That's all I'm saying. Not in front of the kids. But when you're with your mates, F and Jeff as much as you like. Yes, he shouldn't be doing it in this kind of situation. But again, that is only if you have the etiquette, and etiquette comes from experience, and experience hasn't been granted to him. At one point, the Justice Secretary's submission had actually been delayed, and he mutters, "Fucking hell." He's frustrated. I'd rather have somebody being who they are in that moment than hiding and pretending to be all pleasant and lovely when actually beneath the surface, they really feel a totally different way. And this kind of behaviour continues. So following pauses during the hearing, he stated, "We'll be here all fucking day, won't we?" Now, that's very childish. It's what you expect your kids to say, isn't it? Without the effing. You know, when you're impatient and you're not engaged with what's happening, maybe everything's being said about you, but nothing's really being said to you. These are all scenarios that I think would be very difficult for him to tolerate. He also describes a former prison warden that he held hostage as an arsehole. He actually stated, "Governor Wallace was an arsehole, is an arsehole, and will die an arsehole." It's not acceptable that he took that guy hostage. I will say I have met quite a lot of arseholes in my time, and the sentiments that I feel do mirror what he says. Once an arsehole, often always an arsehole. Still doesn't legitimise his actions, but let's not pretend that people are lovely in certain situations and scenarios of power. They're not. They are arseholes. And we have no evidence to say he is, but also no evidence to say he isn't. That's Bronson's perspective, and he's entitled to it, but not the right place to be saying it. Not a right place to be defending his actions. Also, he actually stated that he felt that he should have only been incarcerated for 35 years as opposed to the 50 years that he'd served. When it comes down to the prison psychologists, a prison psychologist expressed doubts about how he'd cope in society, because obviously they get reports of the psychologists because they want to ensure that the kind of level of threat to society is understood. It's really important when you're dealing with parole to ensure that when you let somebody go, you have a confidence that their nature will be such that they can not reoffend. And to some degree, there is a level of responsibility on you to make that decision, and it must be very challenging. I appreciate that. So they're saying that, you know, at the end of the day, he is somebody who in prison poses a moderate risk to violence. So when he's in the prison population, you know, there's this moderate risk now. So bear in mind, not severe now, because this guy hasn't done anything in years, right? So there has been a complete drop and change in his violence. So they're saying whilst incarcerated, it's moderate, but if he gets out, it's going to be high. Again, I don't know why they link being free with a higher risk of violence. I would say when you look at his history, most of the violence has actually been in prison as opposed to outside. There was another psychologist, they concluded that he would be best staying where he is and being gradually introduced to an open condition, so an open prison, for example. I would certainly agree with that psychologist. I still don't feel that staying where he is the best course of action. I think it's going to breed resentment, intolerance, and it's going to make him feel that genuinely there's no need to have any respect for authority because They literally have incarcerated him for 5 decades, and he is desperate to be free. And now he is still having his freedom resisted on all levels. The parole board apparently heard that he held anti-authoritarian views. Welcome to me, and a lot of you don't deny it. I have massive anti-authoritarian views, particularly in light of what we've been through in the past few years. I don't think that having an issue with systems, a rebellious nature, a belief that the world isn't fair, I don't think that makes you a bad person. I appreciate they're saying it in the context of the fact that he acts out with authority in prison. But again, I do believe that there are reasons as to why he's developed that mindset. I don't think that he respects a system that he feels has shown him no respect. Again, that does not defend any of his actions whatsoever. The things that he has been in trouble for, he deserves to be in trouble for, without a shadow of a doubt. But we have to think about what models a mindset, what creates a mindset, what amplifies a mindset, what sustains a mindset. But again, that's not going to go well for him, anti-authoritarian, because of the fact that when you go into society, you have to act according to the rules and regulations of the law. They also said that he was suspicious of the motives of others, and also that he had a romanticised view of his past violence. Again, I struggle with that. They have literally profited from this man in so many ways. There have been films made about him. They are romanticised films, without a doubt. You don't put Tom Hardy in a film playing Bronson and not imagine there's a romanticised view of him. That's been exacerbated externally, not internally. And the problem is that for somebody like Bronson, there are very few things to hold on to when you've had everything taken away. So you'll hold on to the image of what you've become, the myth of the man, not the reality of the human. And another way of managing your past misdemeanors is to romanticize them. Again, I'm not excusing them. I'm just trying to understand and unpick the psychology of this. But ultimately, when it came down to that hearing, no one who gave evidence felt that he was ready to be released. None of them. And also, just a side note as well, just talking about the myth of this guy. There is a man called George Bambi, self-proclaimed PR guru and paparazzi. And basically, he has been masquerading as Bronson's son for several years and feeding stories into the press and controlling a narrative. And this guy was meant to, as far as I'm concerned, be Bronson's confidant and friend. And yet all I'm seeing at the moment is him trying to make as much money as possible and also standing by the decision of the parole board. Just want to have his name out there because genuinely individuals like that really concern me. Apart from the obvious failures in the prison system, not actually sniffing out this person and not being able to protect Bronson from this kind of relationship, that in itself is deeply concerning. But also the fact that the press are giving opportunities to him to come out and talk about the relationship, to break the confidence, as far as I'm concerned, between him and Bronson, but also to cash in. There is something so distasteful about that kind of person. Just throwing it out there. Bit of my pet peeve, guys. You know me. I have those pet peeves. Personally, I'm not there. I'm not privy to all the information. I can only tell you from my research. I think that at his age and with his drop in violence in the past few years and his desperation to be released, with the right kind of ongoing support and strict supervision, the opportunity to live a quieter life, that would be something that I would wish to work towards for him. And I would wish to work towards that for him because he's otherwise going to die in prison. And I don't think he needs to. And I also think that would be a terrible indictment of our system. Now, one of the things a lot of you will know Bronson for is those trademark round shades. And I think, again, this just adds to the bias that people have about him because people just assume this is a fashion statement, and it isn't. This is not a fashion statement. It's because he's been kept in a dimly lit cell most of his life. And that means that he's not able to tolerate the light. It gives him headaches. Also, another consequence of these years of being kept in isolation is that he really can't handle people being too close to him. And he says that he's sickened by other people's smell. And it really intrigues me because of the light sensitive issues that understandably has been caused to some degree by the dimly lit cells, but also the smell, the being close to people. There's a little bit of me that wonders, was he ever tested for autism? By the way, we all know autism does not make you violent in any way, shape or form, but you can be a violent person and also be on the spectrum. But there were just some red flags to me, like the idea of feeling socially awkward, which he certainly is. The fact that he doesn't like being close to people, the fact that he feels overloaded by sensory sensation. These are all things that I think would likely, along with his incredible talent and to some degree his eccentricity, mean that he might be a candidate to have an assessment for this. Just throwing it out there, I have no idea. But it just really spoke to me a little bit when I was looking at this research and thinking about how that may affect him, and also how that may mean that he acts in a way that doesn't seem to fit with the understanding social norms of our society, because he doesn't wear the mask that a lot of people with autism do. Because a lot of people with autism spectrum disorder, they actually try to make the world easier for us to manage them. So instead of just being who they are, they feel like they've got to put on this act to fit in. And one of the things in therapy that we work with is an individual learning to be their unique self and feeling proud of their differences. It makes them exceptionally unique, and that makes them special. But again, he wouldn't have that, would he? But the smell, the sight, the feeling intimidated when people are close to you, or feeling, amplified in certain behaviours when people are close to you because it sickens you, it really concerns me. And again, it would add another layer to why he doesn't necessarily come across how people expect him to. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on this particularly. What I want to say that really stands out for me, he's just an example of massive failings within our prison service, because it feels to me like the focus with him, it's all been on retribution rather than rehabilitation. And when people hear the name Charles Bronson, genuinely, a lot of people think he's a serial killer. Genuinely. A lot of people think he's in prison for multiple kills. But Bronson's never killed anybody. He's never harmed a woman. He's never harmed a hair on the head of a child. And whilst multiple rapists, child murderers, and multiple killers have been released from prison, Bronson remains incarcerated. And this is despite the fact that he renounced violence a decade ago. What he is an absolute grade 1 first-class product of the system. We've created him. If you keep somebody in isolation for years, if you treat him like an animal, if you deny his basic rights, if you prevent him having any sense of security, you'll end up with a violent, dangerous individual. And as far as I'm concerned, it's to Bronson's credit that he's as mentally stable as he is. Genuinely. I mean, I don't know how he's survived this long. Often the episodes as well of the vandalism, the hostage taking, all of the violence in those certain circumstances, they tended to be reactions to constantly moving around, the vulnerability he felt about that. And with respect, he's also spent time at all 3 of Britain's most secure hospitals, so psychiatric hospitals, and that in itself demonstrates the fact that he must have had this incredibly turbulent psychological time. He's also been put in 28 conventional prisons. What the hell does that say? 28 prisons? This guy's been incarcerated for 5 decades, but 28 prisons and 3 secure hospitals? That means 31 times. And some places he's been multiple times, isn't he? It's just the definition of absolute instability for an individual who needed stability. Now, I won't deny for 1 minute that Bronson has a massive issue with authority figures. He does, without doubt. He's an individual who struggled throughout his life, I think. So before his campaign of attacking and holding prison governors hostage, which became a bit of his thing, he had actually been sacked for a job because he'd attacked his manager. And so we do see that he struggles to some degree to be told what to do. But a lot of you who work for yourselves, you'll know that the reason that you do that is because you struggle with authority. There is a common thread with some humans where we just don't like other people being in control of our worlds. And he has that, but obviously on a very high volume. And the same kind of mentality and sentiments, I suppose, you can see at his parole hearing. You know, he refused to play the game, even though his freedom depended on it. And he refused to put on an act. He didn't curb his language. He didn't apologise to the staff and to the inmates that he'd injured whilst in prison. And didn't apologise for the damage he'd caused during the protests. In fact, he told the panel with respect that he'd enjoyed every fucking one of them. And as I said, he didn't even say sorry to those he took hostage, apart from Phil Danielson. So Phil Danielson was the art teacher. He did express remorse about taking him. And I feel, again, this is just my own belief systems and you can disagree with them, but I feel that Bronson doesn't feel he needs to. I think as far as he's concerned, he thinks, I served my time. I've paid my price in years. I've paid my price in solitude. I've paid my price in being denied any form of freedom 23 hours of the day. I don't need to apologise. You punished me. Why shall I have to stand here now and say I'm sorry? I am sorry by the way I served my sentence. That's the years you gave me. I've done it. I don't need to stand here and ask for forgiveness because I've served my sentence. I'm not saying that any of us think that that's the right way to go. I think remorse is important. I think expressing remorse is important. But I don't believe that a guy who potentially feels a level of anger about what's happened to him is going to feel comfortable doing that in a public forum. And Bronson actually stated this: give a man a break. We could be sitting around this table until the cow jumps over the moon, talking the same old crap. I'm just a normal geezer wanting to get on with his life. Apparently he claims that he wants to just move to the country, walk on grass, he wants to do his artwork. And it's his 95-year-old mum's absolute dream that she's going to see him free and that she's going to see him making an honest living. So the question is, has Bronson been given the freedom that he so desperately craves? On the 30th of March this year, so just literally a few days ago, the decision was made. And I'm sure that very few of you, if you know about this case, are surprised to hear that his application was again rejected. At least for the time being, he's going to remain behind bars. And it's also worth noting that his secondary plea to be moved to an open prison was also rejected. The panel stated it recognised that Bronson genuinely wants to progress. However, it was mindful of his persistent rule breaking and the fact that he sees very little wrong with this. The panel also observed that he lives rigidly by his own rules and a code of conduct and is quick to judge others by his own standards. And whilst the panel did acknowledge that Bronson had made progress, he had done so in a highly restrictive environment. So they were unconvinced that basically the same progress would play out if he was free. So they felt that he'd be unable to manage his future risk of violence in an environment that changed so drastically. So they've concluded that he's first going to require extensive testing outside of his current environment so that they can even consider a future where he's free. The panel actually stated this: after considering the circumstances of his offending, the progress that Mr. Salvador has made while in custody and the evidence presented at the hearings, the panel was not satisfied that Mr. Salvador was suitable for release. So for now, Britain's most dangerous prisoner will remain exactly that. So personally, whilst I think we all can appreciate the panel's concerns, I think the decision is really harsh. You know, when you think about some of the horrific characters that have been released after serving time, just think about a few of them. So James Bulger's killers, Robert Thompson and John Venables, paedophile Paul Gadd, so Gary Glitter, many of you will know him by. Actually, he's recently been taken back to prison for breaching his license. But that's how manipulative these losers are. They're actually able to manipulate a parole board to believe that they're safe in spite of repeatedly raping kids. But, you know, apparently the parole board are cool with that. Also, they've released child killer and rapist Colin Pitchfork. Again, he was sent back to prison because the parole board are so good at making the right decisions. Also, M25 road rage killer Kenneth Noy and triple child murderer David McGreevy. That's just a few of the individuals who are so delightful the parole board believed that they were safe to put back into the public domain, straight back into the public domain actually. Whereas a guy who's never harmed a child or a woman and who is now 70 and has not been violent for a long time and just wants to go home to his mum is far more of a threat. Yeah. You might think he is. You might think at the end of the day, why take a risk? And I think that that is a well-founded, understandable thought process. But for me, if we're saying that after 5 decades, a guy who's basically been isolated and traumatized by so many things, albeit, yes, he certainly did horrible things and deserved to serve a sentence, he should be at a point where the work has taken place to make him at least put forward to be in a situation where he is released bit by bit, open prison, strict supervision, time with his mum. If we have failed to manage that in those 5 decades, yet we let these child rapists and murderers walk our streets, then I have to ask the question, is Charles Bronson really the most dangerous, violent criminal that walks our prisons? Or is it that history has made him a myth and the parole board do not want to take a risk with somebody so front-facing, so public, so unwilling to toe the party line that when he leaves prison, he's going to speak out, he's going to probably become a celebrity, and he's going to be too hot to handle in the public domain? Is this actually about his violence, or is this about the celebrity status that he's accrued all these years? Personally, I felt sad when the verdict came in. I've gone on record on TV saying that I think it's a horrific indictment of our system. And I would hope, genuinely, that he is given some freedoms as he comes towards the end of his life. Because he is coming towards the end of his life. And you guys know how hardcore I am on this stuff. I wouldn't have let any of the aforementioned individuals out into the public domain, but they all had their bid for freedom. And I would never want a person in public to be at risk from Bronson, but I also think that the system should at least have provisions to ensure that supervision can be so strict and that his freedom can be so staged bit by bit that we will know whether he truly poses a threat or whether he is just left with the bravado of a man who used to be a threat to our society, more a threat to those in prison, than an individual who is now a human being with the provision of art, creativity, opportunity to express himself in more grown ways. And I kind of hope in my head that him and his mum get to sit down and have a cup of Yorkshire tea. He probably wouldn't want to drink Yorkshire tea because it's northern, but I don't know, a nice cup of Twinings together before she dies, before he takes his last breath. But I'd be really intrigued to know your thoughts. You might absolutely think that they've got it right and feel that you should never walk the streets again. And I respect everybody's opinion. Let me know. Hope you've found this interesting. Like I said, it was one of those I wanted to cover, but wanted to make sure I had all the information. I would love to know whether you want to have him freed, whether you believe that an open prison should have been the decision, or whether you do believe that he should spend the next 23 hours out of 24 hours every single day for the rest of his life in solitary confinement, only around another 3 prisoners in the prison population. Maybe you do. Let me know your thoughts. Take care, guys. See you again Wednesdays and Sundays. You know me, crime and consistency. I'll see you soon. Be safe.